Okay, welcome everyone. Grab your beverage of choice and maybe keep the antacids within reach because we need to talk about the election platform nonsense. I'm Nick, your host.
I'm Rio.
And I'm German.
And yes, it is nonsense. Not because policy doesn't matter, but because apparently nobody got the memo that elections aren't supposed to be a surprise party. Let me tell you why that's bullshit. The Liberals dropped their platform on Easter weekend, you know, the sacred time when Canadians are traditionally reading 65 pages of policy PDFs over chocolate bunnies and awkward brunches with their in-laws. And the Conservatives held out even longer, waiting until Wednesday, April 26th, aka the literal last possible moment to publish theirs. Not a soft launch, not a leak, just surprise, here's our entire vision for the country. Hope you can read fast. Seriously, how are we supposed to engage meaningfully with platforms they clearly didn't want us to read? This isn't a group project, it's a national election. And treating voters like we're the kid you remember after the PowerPoint's already been emailed to the teacher, that's not leadership, that's disrespect. So in this episode, we're going to break it all down. Not just what they're saying, but what they're hiding, who they're blaming, and why some of this reads like fanfic. You're going to hear the vibes and voices straight from the source. We've got conservative promises to lock up criminals and cut red tape like it's 1995, and Jean Chrétien just got a modem. Liberal manifestos about sovereignty and shadows, and bold decorations like if America won't lead, Canada will. Okay, Carney, calm down. We're still using fax machines in some government offices. So let's dive in.
We have some very strong opinions and ideas, and I think we'll probably state those opinions now.
Okay, guys, how are you?
I'm good.
Rio, Rio, you're so like unconvincing.
Yeah, I'm alive. So
That's a step up from this morning.
Yeah, like this morning I was sick. Last night I was sick. Now I'm less sick. But on the bright side, Oblivion Remastered came out. So that's been awesome. And Nick, you and I were talking about this earlier. The Switch 2 pre-orders open up at Walmart at 10 p.m. tonight. So yeah, I'm excited for that. So we have a hard stop time.
10:01
for that,
but
right?
only at Walmart.
Yeah. I literally have the Walmart page already open. I'm just going to smash the refresh button as soon as 10:01 hits. So,
did you upload your credit card?
Oh,
I uploaded my credit card and I created an account. I'm going to get one and you're not.
Nope. I guess I'll do that in between like my bits on the show.
I know who to bug if I need to borrow your machines.
Of course, I'm going to have at least one of those. Okay. Oh, and thanks for asking, German. I'm fine. I'm stoked also about the Nintendo Switch. I was doing some game streaming earlier, which is why I'm decked out in Mario and Kirby stuff. Plus, it just makes me happy. And this is not going to be very happy. So with that said, let's just jump right into the introduction. I thought we would start. Do I still have it? I don't. So I thought we would start by, I thought I had a video, but I don't. I thought we'd start by just going over like the main points of the platforms, like the things that they wanted to make sure were in our face, which is very telling. So the Liberals had four main points right at the beginning of their document. Free trade in Canada by July 1st, which is Canada Day. I think they did that on purpose. Achieve mutual recognition of credentials within provinces and territories so Canadians can work where they want. This is also mostly aimed at like doctors and nurses and those professions that have like very specific regulations, mental health workers, that kind of stuff. Red tape, he wants to undertake reviews and do reporting progress reports on the different departments within government, and then protect our economic sovereignty by unlocking projects that grow our economy. So Mark Carney, very focused on Canadian sovereignty. He wants you to be thinking about Donald Trump as you're reading his document. The Conservatives also had four main points. Well, 3 1/4. The first point was cut the deficit by 70% with less spending on bureaucracy, consultants, and foreign aid. Rio, you can talk about that in a few minutes. Lower income tax by 15%, lock up criminals, and then literally their last point was put Canada first. I don't mean to make fun of them, but that's not really like that shouldn't be there. That's not. What are you guys doing?
I mean, are we putting Canada second otherwise is like the main thing, right? Like,
it
or
kind of
maybe Russia's first all of a sudden, right?
it kind of made me think about when I was watching the debate and they were talking about Pierre Poilievre was doing his like notwithstanding violent criminals thing, and Jagmeet Singh interrupted him, as he did a lot, to say that like, come on, it's not like all of us on stage want to let criminals off. Like nobody up here wants to see violent criminals go loose. So it kind of reminded me of that, right?
Yeah.
So let's go back to the Liberals for a minute and just kind of talk about like a very big overview of the document. So the Liberal platform itself is really dense. It was 65 pages long, small print, which is about triple the Conservative platform, which is 30 pages, large print. And almost every page was at least a quarter to a half of just like promotional pictures of Pierre Poilievre. If not full, they had 3 pages of full advertising basically in it. Which isn't, we can get into later about like whether that's good or bad. But that's to say the Liberal document was super dense. I did like that it had like, this is what we're going to do. This is the context and this is why we're going to do it. So it was a bit more comprehensive than the Conservatives, because the Conservatives, well, they did explain some things. They were mostly just like, we're going to lock up criminals.
Yeah.
And right, like very like, but it was also very digestible, right? Which Carney's wasn't. So I did kind of appreciate that from the Conservative platform, because I was like, yeah, I can just read this. Took me about an hour and a half to read the Conservative platform and do notes last night. Then I was up till 2 a.m. reading and taking notes on Carney's platform. And I'm pretty sure I'm the only Canadian in Canada that is not officially a part of any party that actually read that fucking document. You're welcome, everyone. The tone was very red Tory. One of his top 3 priorities was cutting red tape. As we know, especially in Alberta, that is very much a Conservative talking point, cut red tape. So I'll kind of hand it over. There's a couple things I do want to talk about it later, but like what were your guys' thoughts upon seeing that and sort of the Liberals' main points? Rio, go.
Sure.
German and I have talked a lot this week.
Sure. And I actually spent some time reading the Liberal platform this afternoon because, nothing better to do when I'm sick and taking a day off work. So, but
we're a fun crowd.
Yeah, we're a fun crowd. But a lot of for me, when I was kind of reading through the Liberal platform, like I agree it does come across as very red Tory. And then like even when I got to like the costing section, like I feel like it makes a lot of sense, right? And like in a lot of ways, like the liberal platform shares a lot of similarities with the Conservative platform, like increasing the number of like CBSA officers and RCMP officers, and the number strengthening law enforcement. So there are a lot of like little bits and pieces like that where it's like, yeah, this really is like 2 sides of the same coin, and that's where you get that red Tory bit, right? And
in crime, it's not a bad thing. You want that mixed methods approach.
Exactly. And especially especially considering like Canada's like the 2nd largest country in the world, and it's so diverse. And I mentioned this to you, Nick, before like German hopped on, of like I was driving out from I drove out to Drumheller for the weekend. I went to go see the museum, and then driving back home, I blasted through the town of Basiker, population 680 people, with an RCMP station that I'm pretty sure had no one in it, and so I just like drove right past it, going like 70, and I was like, oh, whoops, that was a 50 zone.
They were all at the one coffee place in town.
Yeah, the one coffee place in Basic,
which I think is that gas station on the corner.
Yeah, it's like really says a lot, right? So yeah, that's kind of where my thoughts are. Like I see the perspective, and like especially with regards to law enforcement, you do want that additional support, but Yeah, the 2000, like the 1000 versus 2000 at the same time too. You have to think about like, is that really going to do much to really stamp down crime, especially when crime doesn't tend to happen or the extreme crimes don't tend to happen as often in like population 680 towns like Basic or Alberta, right? It's mostly in like big cities like the greater metropolitan Toronto area or like Calgary, Edmonton, so on.
Well, I see, the thing is, and this was the other thing that irked me about both of their platforms. It's one thing to say like we're going to hire 1,000 RCMP officers, but where are you hiring? And I suspect that for Mark Carney, because he also spends a lot of time talking about organized crime and tackling that. So I have a feeling that we'll see more hiring in specialty RCMP stuff to deal with the border and deal with fentanyl and deal with organized crime to sort of appease Donald Trump's fake lying fentanyl thing that he's blaming on Canada for a reason to tariff and invade us. Yeah, so I suspect it'll be less like officer bodies and more like specialized case RCMP officers.
Yeah.
German, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you guys for sure. And it is definitely it's like you said, twice the size of the conservative platform. And it's very heavily, there's lots of heavy text and things like that. Not many images I've noticed from what the pages I've seen.
There's zero, none.
And that's the thing, right? It's very like reading a
Other
book.
than like the front page.
Yeah, and I noticed that too. But the one thing, I'll take a little bit of a different approach in terms of that particular platform. Is the one thing I really liked is that the fact that it really emphasized Canadian voices, and that's where I really zoomed in, because they talked about giving money to these arts organizations. As some of the listeners might know, is that I was actually sitting on a few art sports. And so for me, that really speaks to me as an arts lover and an art supporter and a supporter of the arts. They want to increase and support Canadian artists, creators by increasing funding to agencies such as Canadian Council of the Arts, Telefilm, Canadian Media Fund, and the National Film Board. So for me, that's something that really stood out in this particular platform, and I really think that was something that I like really noticed, and I didn't see something similar in the conservative platform.
There isn't.
So for me, that's something that really stood out. And like, yes, it's double the pages, it's very heavy text, so unless you're really interested in reading it, I personally would have read it myself, right? So that's my opinion, and I totally agree with what you two have said already on those things.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like, and we're definitely going to get into like the weeds later on. So I thought it's pretty important for me to make sure that I'm looking objectively at it. People get very angry at me because it's very clear that I don't like Pierre Poilievre. I think he'll be bad for Canada. And I'm very much of a liberal ideology, not of the party. Liberal ideology. They're different people. But yeah, like there were things overall that I really liked. So personally, the global leadership stuff, it's like a big task. Canada's very small. So like it's a little dreamy, but he did write on pages 19 and 20. It was and he said this a couple of times in press releases, like when talking to reporters and giving speeches over the campaign. This was pretty much exactly taken from those speeches. So he said, "It was America that once declared itself a shining city on a hill, but today it is casting a shadow. We will step out from behind the shadow to defend our sovereignty and our values around the world. If the United States no longer wants to lead, Canada will." And see, this is super interesting to me because anybody that knows their history knows that America was the one that centered themselves as sort of like the global leader. They were the ones with nuclear weapons as an example. And the trade-off there was them saying like, we don't want any of you to have nuclear weapons, but don't worry, like we're going to protect you from Russia. And in fact, they also got the Ukraine to de-arm themselves from their nuclear weapons, which is like super ironic today, given the way Ukraine's being treated, and kind of is well, the US has basically screwed themselves at this point because it's going to take generations for them to claw their way back up to any kind of trust. So I thought that was really interesting because Mark Carney is an economist and he's looking at this as an opportunity. And that opportunity is, well, when you're that global that global leader, that's why we have the reserve. The US currency is our reserve global currency, which makes their currency basically one of the most valuable currencies in the world. It's why people put their money in America. That kind of thing, right? So yeah, I think that he's really thinking economically that it's a good place for Canada to be. Because if suddenly like the Canadian dollar becomes a global reserve currency, and like I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but it's definitely something you can move towards, right? And Mark Carney has his eye on Europe. We know that. He already has ins with many European leaders because of his tenure at the Bank of England. So people were kind of making fun of me about the EU stuff, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility for Mark Carney to do everything he can to pull us into the EU. So I don't know. I'll throw it over to you guys. What did you think? What did you guys think about his global leadership pitch?
German, why did you take this one first?
Rio's like, I have to think about it.
It's an interesting approach for sure, and I think it's something that I think he's thinking with the issues that are going on at the states level. I think he's thinking as an opportunity for Canada to build those relationships across different countries, and I think that it is an interesting approach, and it definitely is something to consider. It's something we would have to figure out whether we want to be part of the EU, right? Because there's a lot of restrictions, like do we keep our same currency, for example, all those other things that come with it, right? So I think that it's something that maybe he's trying to think as a trade perspective, whether there's an opportunity to build relationships, but at the same time, we want to make sure we maintain, I guess, our nationalism, or like our view as an independent country too, because there's a certain type of level of collectivism that might be from that situation. But it's definitely an interesting approach for sure.
Yeah, and like kind of building on that, so my thought process always and I think I mentioned this on the podcast a couple of times. I was like,
we've had this conversation.
Yeah, I'm pro Canada being more involved with the EU, or like pro Kanzuk as an example, right?
Yeah,
because like I think he's right in that, like, if the United States is kind of starting to pull back into a more isolationist position, it makes sense for Canada to kind of try and fill that gap a little bit more by going to Europe, going to like Australia, New Zealand, going into Asia as another example, and saying like, hey, do you guys want a reliable trading partner like right next door to the United States that can help you get your products there, or big economy that's also like very profitable and very stable? Canada's where you want to go, right? Like our economy isn't enormous, don't get me wrong. Where like, what was it? When I looked at the Wikipedia last time, it was like $4 trillion like total, compared to the United States is like 45 trillion, right? So like our economy is 10% of the United States, but that's still a lot of opportunity for everyone. And then like, tie that into the European Union, like about 20 trillion. And then all of a sudden you're almost at 30 trillion. So you're almost on par with the United States economy, right? So there's an opportunity there. And I think Carney's right to kind of start pursuing that. Is like, it's a good chance to help put Canada in a better position going forward, and less dependent on the United States as well. Because as we've clearly seen in the last like 4 months alone, we can't really depend on the United States anymore, right?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's talk about the Conservatives. And I'm going to put some context behind them. Well, not context, but I'll say that the things that we wanted to talk about in this segment are more a little bit of criticism. We'll get into the good parts, the few that there were, in my opinion, in the Conservative platform a bit later. But one thing that I wanted to talk about, because I think it's really important, and German, I want your insight on this because you work in like finance. Mm-hmm. So on page 5 for our readers, and if anybody's looking for these platforms, the Conservative one is really hard to find on their website, but it's going to be linked in the description below, as is Carney's. I'll also link a couple CBC and Global News articles on like comparing the platforms. But on page 5 of the conservative platform, they talk at the about halfway down, the bring it home tax reform, where it says, actually, I'm going to actually pull this up because I want to read the whole bit. Page 5. Okay. Bring it home tax reform. After a decade of increasing complexity and loopholes that benefit the wealthy and well-connected, it's time to bring fairness and simplicity back to our tax system. We'll put people who actually build things in charge of designing tax code that works for Canadians who actually do the work. Within 60 days of forming government, we will launch a tax reform task force made up of farmers, builders, entrepreneurs, economists, and workers, not Ottawa insiders. Their job will be to deliver a simple, fair tax code that rewards work and savings, closing loopholes for the wealthy and well-connected, eliminates unnecessary red tape, and makes it easier for Canadians to file and understand their taxes. So in terms of the goal for this, that all sounds fine. Where my concern is the absolute insanity of having farmers and other sort of blue-collar workers making our tax codes. Like, does that kind of raise a red flag to anyone else? Like, I'm very pro, like, talking to people, doing your research, getting people's perspectives, but this sounds insane to me.
Yeah, I'll answer that question a little bit. I'm a little bit confused by that, to be honest with you, because yeah, I get farmers are workers, builders, I can understand, maybe entrepreneurs, depending on the entrepreneurs, economists, workers. I don't know, because each of those people are very different from each other, right? And I get that they're not Ottawa insiders, but at the same time, entrepreneurs have a different type of tax level, just at the best of times. And then, of course, I don't know, like workers have a different type of tax level as well. So
even understanding of basic taxes.
Yeah, and I don't know whether farmers necessarily understand taxes either. And most farmers don't really
They don't
earn
even
money.
do their own taxes.
And most of the farmers don't actually earn a lot of money. From my experience, when I was working at the government, a lot of them didn't even have income, let alone profit most years, because of how much it costs to be a farmer. Like there's a lot of capital costs. There's a lot of, costs that come in terms of, buying stuff for your farm, buying things for the animals like feed. So I really don't know how this will actually work and how big this task force would be. And I feel like entrepreneurs, a lot of them are pretty wealthy and pretty well connected anyway, depending on the business.
You think they're going to want to close loopholes?
And I don't think they would be fighting for the average person. I can understand maybe workers might, but at the same time, I don't know a lot of workers that even understand taxes, let alone even know taxes, depending on where they work and what role they're in.
Or even the current tax code, right?
Yeah, and that's something they would need to know, right?
Like, I'm a sociologist that specializes in crime and mental health. I've never done my own taxes in my whole life. My mother-in-law does our taxes. They own
and there's a lot of stuff.
So like I don't know anything about taxes. I would never be like, put me on that committee.
There's a lot of things that even I don't know as well, because it changes. Taxes change constantly, year to year, period to period.
During tax season, look at the capital gain stuff.
Yeah, and all that changes, and unless you're a tax expert, maybe a CPA or a tax lawyer, you really don't know the nitty-gritties of what taxes are and those special deductions and special credits you can take on. So to throw in like workers, economists, entrepreneurs, farmers, and builders, I'm not sure whether that would really help, especially when you have entrepreneurs who are mostly well-connected people and they own their own businesses. So do you really think they would want to really create a system that brings fairness? I don't think so. But unless he's bringing certain people that really care about the economy and care about people, but I don't think entrepreneurs have that mentality of making it fair for everyone, because they're the ones, if anything, they don't want to pay taxes. A lot of owners, especially the small business owners, do not want to pay taxes. I can understand the workers maybe, but I don't know how many workers actually understand their own taxes.
Nobody
right?
wants to pay taxes.
And like
Yeah.
farmers, like they don't even earn money. So if not hardly any money. So I don't know how that works. Builders, I don't know why he would have chose builders as well. So I'm kind of confused kind of how that really creates fairness, because it kind of gets rid of all the other people, right? The other people who are not even like involved in those areas, right? Why certain people are included?
Yeah. Like,
That's my take.
yeah. And like,
All I all I can think about right now is how I'm not gonna get like destroyed in the comments because German was just talking about farmers. Yes.
But at the same time, like I'm not saying farmers are not, they don't earn, I'm not saying that they're not, but at the same time, like for me, farmers don't earn a lot of income from my experience. Like they just don't, because it's so much cost involved.
Yeah,
right?
but people are gonna be like, that doesn't mean we don't get say in the tax code.
But at the same, I'm not saying you guys don't, farmers don't understand, but why
just
do you
giving you a
choose
hard
certain
time.
these people, right?
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
Entrepreneurs especially, right?
Oh, for sure. Like you said, they're gonna fight for wealthy. Rio, sorry, I cut you off.
no, it's fine. Because I just had like I was thinking about this a little while ago. Because like what usually happens, especially for farmers, and like they mentioned this in like my favorite book, The Dictator's Handbook, is like usually they get tax credits, right? And like tax credits are a great way to reward farmers for like doing their job. And like you said, German, like they tend to not make a lot of profit or a lot of money in general because like it's so expensive to do, right? Like if you have like say I have a buddy's his family has a farm that's like 10 acres as an example, right? So like if you have 10 acres of land, you're paying property tax on that, in addition to the fact that you have to like seed it, fertilize it, keep it watered throughout the summer. And in Alberta we get hot summers, right? Like you're not going to be able to just like water it and be like, yeah, we can get away with it for 2 days. Like, no, you need to keep those fields, like you need to keep them going. So like I can understand the perspective of having like diverse, or I can understand the idea of having diverse perspectives at the table, but you're both right that like, an entrepreneur is going to be like, well, I don't want to pay more taxes. That's not fair. Like, to my perspective, I was an entrepreneur. That wouldn't be fair to me. Similarly, a farmer would be like, well, why would I have to give my tax credit just for like da 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 da? And like, it doesn't make sense. And it's one of those things where it's like, well, you can just focus group this, or you can like survey this, or you can even just like, do a quantitative analysis of this and just see like what the data says, like who's making how much, and like generally speaking, like in what fields, and then kind of like tailor your tax code from there. So like, and full disclosure, my understanding of the tax code is like, I understand that I pay taxes into a system that's supposed to give me things. And like, I
Most
got
of your taxes go to healthcare, Rio.
yeah, I know. And like, I got my carbon tax
In
rebate the other
Alberta,
day.
healthcare.
Healthcare. Yeah. I got my carbon tax rebate the other day, but like, that's about it. That's all I know, really.
It'll be the last one you'll get.
Yep.
And I'll just add quickly before we kind of move on, or whatever you want to talk about. 60 days of forming government, that's a really short time frame. That's like 2 months. Does that, if you're cutting public service, you're cutting civil servants who work for the government, do you really think there's even enough time to do that in 2 months when you form government? There's so many other things that might be needed to work on.
And
And like,
if you're gonna do a shitty job at it.
and I'll just add farmers. Like I know farmers when I was dealing with them at the government. I know a lot of them work long hours. They work long days. Do you really think they have a time to jump on a call or meet with you because they're worried about their produce and their animals and whatnot?
And it's interesting you bring that up because I consult with a not-for-profit that works with farmers a lot, and it is a pain in the ass to get them anywhere. And the only way to do it is to like visit their house basically and like sit at their table, have a cup of coffee and be like, answer my questions. I helped create like focus groups for farmers.
Mm-hmm.
Horrible experience. So like good luck getting them on a Zoom call to talk about tax code.
And I'll just add quickly now that you bring that up, because I remember when I was working with farmers, and to get a hold of them and tell them that they owe money in taxes, they don't even know what it even means. Like they're saying, how do I owe money? Who do I owe money to? How do I pay? They don't even know anything. So you have to educate them too. Like I'm not saying farmers don't know things, but farmers and anyone else
what they know is carbon soil.
Yeah, they don't know what the tax system works,
fertilizers.
right now. And other people might not know the tax system, including those people listed there. But you need to spend time educating them first, right? And so to even get them on a phone call is almost impossible, let alone hard to do,
Yeah,
right?
and
So
then do it in 60 days.
that's unrealistic, in my opinion.
That's a nice way of putting it. Okay, so speaking of like taxes and money and stuff, let's talk a little bit about the fiscal stuff in the platform. So we're going to watch something from a former parliamentary budget officer that'll give us like a really good take to take into the rest of the conversation and into our first segment. But I wanted to talk about what the Conservatives on page 26, for anybody that's following along, okay, want to do. And so there's a line that's 2025 and 2026. So they want to gain revenue, which is from either cuts or expanding resources. One of the things that came up on here is things like cutting funding to CBC. So I want to just talk a little bit about that. German, I know you were fairly interested in talking about CBC and defunding. What's really interesting to note is that they don't want to cut Radio Canada, which for our Anglophone listeners is the Francophone CBC.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And they don't want to cut the Radio Canada, which is the French side.
Which is like just to try to get more votes in Quebec, which we've talked about this on the show before. Cutting any kind of journalism in Quebec would actually be a huge it would basically be political suicide in Quebec. Quebecers really like their media because they see them as their voice for sovereignty. It's one of the reasons why media out of Quebec talk quite frequently about how Poilievre kind of messed up by treating the media the way he does, because Quebecers look at that and they're like, well, we can't trust you worth anything. So in there on page 23, they say we will save by defunding the CBC and reforming crown corporations. They don't say what other crown corporations, which is interesting. While maintaining Radio Canada services, English language CBC should be a Canadian-owned, self-sufficient media organization that is a not-for-profit and supported by listeners, donations, sponsorships, ad revenue, and licensing revenue. I'll let you talk about this a little bit, German.
Yeah, that's, for me, is a very interesting point, because when you look at the Liberal platform, for example, they talk about investing in these things, like they invest in CBC. So it's a big contrast between the two in terms of what they want to approach. I actually have a friend who works for CBC in Nova Scotia, which I don't like. I'm not going to mention the name, but I think she'd be pretty embarrassed that I'm talking about her anyway. But she's a nice person, so I won't mention any names. But she said to me that she has trouble paying her rent. She's an associate producer for one of the morning shows in CBC, and she said to me, I said to her, "Why are you having trouble paying your rent, and what's going on?" She said, "I said, are you not working enough, or what's going on?" She said, "I'm working too much, but the salary I'm getting paid is not even enough to cover my rent." And so, like, if you defund the CBC, especially the English, she worked for the Nova Scotia one, can you imagine? She'll be paid even less, and she's working like 12, 13, 14 hour, 15 hour, 16-hour days. So it's like she's overworked and underpaid. So that's crazy, right? If you think about it.
Which
right?
I think Poilievre would argue that if you privatize it, she'll make more money.
Yeah, but at the same time, like
No, I'm just saying that would be the conservative argument.
And that probably is, right? But you look at something like the Liberal platform, they're investing in culture and arts and all these things.
$150 million to CBC right away, they said.
And that's the thing. And so the only reason the Conservatives are not taking on the Radio Canada is because they want that French vote, right? So, and that's the thing that they
won't get right now.
Yeah, they probably won't get it, but they're still trying. And it makes it seem like they are prioritizing certain services and certain things over others, right? Which is not good for culture-wise in Canada, let alone media in Canada. Like you see all these, like he says he wants to boost local journalism. $25 million for local news. Like, we know local news is starting to die now. Like,
Yeah.
all local stations are starting to die. So like,
Even legacy media, people don't want to watch that. They're going to podcasters like Joe Rogan,
yeah, and that's the thing about it. And so
which
like,
is scary.
it's so scary. And so you're not really funding a public broadcaster, which I get there's probably savings to be made and there's like stuff that needs to be efficient and all this stuff. But it just kind of creates a contradictory thing. And it kind of creates a red flag when you're supporting French, but you're not supporting English, right? And whereas like the Liberals are funding CBC, they're investing in this thing, they're investing in culture. And for me, that's a bit of a scariness to it. It's like, why are you not? And they say a new conservative government restore free speech, protect personal liberties, and honor our shared story and promote Canadian culture and history. So for me, that really kind of goes contradictory. And it says we would support media freedom by these things. So it doesn't really help with anything, right?
Yeah, and it really contrasts the liberal platform too, because the liberal platform has a whole section about like, kind of uniting Canadians and uniting Canada, and then like you already mentioned the 150 million to CBC as an example, but like nation building is more than like, you can't nation build by making it harder for people to find information relevant to their country and other parts of the country.
Indigenous people, as an example, CBC is pretty much one of, in fact, if not the only place for a lot of Indigenous culture and Indigenous news.
Yeah.
I don't see CTV reporting on the ins and outs of things that are happening in Indigenous communities, but there's entire sections for it on the CBC website.
Yeah, or if you see it, like as another example too, like that show North of North on the CBC Gem, it's about it's a North, like, Nunavut community. They're all Inuvik. It's a I watched 2 episodes and I was like, okay, I'll get to this later. But it was a good show and it was really interesting because I was like, cool, never thought about this before, right? And like that's one of those perspectives that I wouldn't have had without the CBC, because I've never seen that kind of show on like CTV or Global, right? Especially Global, which will play like, oh yeah, it's SWAT again, but like in another city, and something about firefighters this time, like different.
The
different
10th Law and Order.
Oh my God, yeah, that.
And I should add quickly, because you bring up the whole thing on Global and CTV, is that you notice when you see these media outlets and when profit and when it's a public company worried about shareholder value, you see those companies, they start cutting stations and reporters across the country. You see that with CTV, you see that with Global, and so they start cutting. I think Global
CNN.
Right now, yeah, CNN, right, for example, right, and you see this they start cutting people. For example, I know Global right now, they have a lot of their news for certain weekend editions are coming out of Edmonton, so they're cutting local stations. So $25 million is a drop in the bucket compared to how much these stations and these local stations need right now.
Yeah.
So it's a small, and so it's like it kind of contradicts. And you talk about funding first made Canadian documentaries, for example, about Canadian contribution. How are you going to promote that if you don't have a media outlet to do that, right?
The answer is he's not. Speaking of cuts, Rio, you wanted to talk about foreign aid. So another thing that Poilievre is going to get, he's counting it as technically like, this was the other thing that bothered me. His revenue stuff was all based on what he was cutting. And like in his revenue section, he has listed revenue from carbon tax cuts. Like it made my brain hurt. I know.
Yeah,
because then they get to open up resource, right? So then they like gain revenue from that. And then they talk about revenue gain from cutting Bill C-69, which was a bunch of crap that German and I talked about the other day. So if anybody's really interested in that, it's one of the many, many videos that went on our YouTube page this week. But foreign aid, that's another thing that Pierre Poilievre wants to cut. Who does that sound like, Rio?
Yeah, I know. Who does that sound like? It's our neighbor down south. And like I've mentioned this before, and like especially to the two of you, and I know for sure I mentioned this on the podcast, but foreign aid is a tool to get policy concessions from other countries, right? And like, I think I gave the example before of like, I think it was Denmark that sent ships down to like Africa on the condition that whenever the ships need maintenance, they get sent back to Denmark for maintenance, right? They didn't authorize the people in the countries that they sent the ships to do the work themselves, which is a policy and like, of course they're like, well, we need the ships, so yeah, we'll take the deal. But it benefited Denmark because, you know, they had the sale and they have the maintenance contracts for the next, like, you know, 15, 20 years, the lifetime of the ship, whatever it is. And like, that's a huge amount of money from one country, right? So cutting foreign aid is just one of those things where it's like, well, you're giving up your ability to get those policy concessions from other countries. And like, with food becoming more expensive because, you know, climate change, or, you know, Russia invading Ukraine, or as another example, yeah, right, or tariffs as another example, yeah, like, you need ways to kind of like get the prices lower for those imports, and a good way to do that would be through things like foreign aid. So like, to me, cutting it is kind of dumb. And like, yes, funneling it into defense like is not the worst idea. Like, I can definitely think of like other ones that I would probably be more in favor of, but you're giving up your ability to get a policy concession in order to, you know, basically, you know, fund the military a bit more when you could, you know, help mitigate some of the problems that the average Canadian is going to have by using foreign aid as a tool. So like, I want to take a minute to criticize that, because I think it's kind of a like, I think it's kind of a bad move. Like, why would I want to give up that leverage I have over someone else when, you know, in order to gain like a military advantage that's not going to be very meaningful against someone like, say, Russia or the United States? And then the other part of that too is we already have so much, like, Canada has like such a good reputation like internationally for these kinds of things, that like, you're giving up that other part, which then has the problem of you've given up, like what the US has done, you've given up your position of power to be like, yeah, no, Canada first, I'm going to cut this and I'm going to take my ball and go home because I don't want you guys to play with it. So,
But it's probably going to be infected with Ebola.
Yeah, exactly. And like, I don't know. It's just, I can think of better policy alternatives than cutting foreign aid and putting it into the defense, right? And like, to not
Foreign aid is also, though, like such a like drop in the bucket that it's not really going to make a difference to, just like in the US, it's not going to make a difference to the defense budget.
Yep. Like, and if you cut it in half, put that in the defense budget, that's however many millions of dollars. That's not enough to really make a difference, like on a large scale military, right? And like, you know, say $5 million as an example, like really easy number. Like, you pay a private in the Canadian forces about $45,000 a year, if I did my estimate correctly. Like,
and both parties want to give raises to military.
Yeah.
Which,
so
like, yay, I'm very in favor of that.
Yeah, which is a great policy. But like, you know, if you get that extra 5 million, how many extra soldiers is that really, right? Anyway, yeah, that's my little criticism of what I consider to be a not smart move by the Conservative Party that I think could be supplemented by something better.
And I guess the only thing I'd add is on the flip side of that, Carney wants to basically also step into a global leadership role there, because he's talking about increasing foreign aid where the US is sort of screwing up here. Side note on that, he's also talking about increasing research funding in order to get researchers that are basically being cut in the US on like major projects like cancer and other things, to also bring them to Canada. So I don't know. I feel like one of those policies is definitely better than the other.
Yep.
I'm pro defeating cancer. Okay, so really quickly, just to sort of like give us something to keep in mind as we go through the rest of this, we're going to look at what Kevin Page had to say about both platforms, and they rate them. So hang on, let me do a screen share here in my like scene setup from the weekend. Entire screen. Sure. Okay. So we'll watch the Conservative one first.
Now to talk about what he found. And Kevin, of course, is a former parliamentary budget officer. So Kevin Page, it's good to see you. Thanks for doing this. And I know you're rushing to get these out the door, so we appreciate you being here, sir.
Good to be with you, David.
All right, so let's start with the conservative platform because it's the one that is the hottest off the press. They assume that their policies will increase economic activity and create more than $50 billion in new tax revenue. I mean, was it reasonable for them to include that in their math based on what you've looked at?
No. It's pretty much a traditional practice, David, in the financial community, to be aware of what the potential, positive economic impacts could be from, putting in measures, but actually to have them hit a bottom line is sort of to take credit and plan based on create a lower deficit track. That isn't, it's not a good budgeting practice. So I would say that is a mistake, on the conservative part.
Okay, so let's go through this because I've just been handed sort of the IFSD fiscal credibility assessment. For the Conservatives, and we'll go through the Liberals right after this because they're the two main contenders for power here. You give them an overall assessment of a pass. Principle 1, realistic and credible economic and fiscal assumptions, pass. Responsible fiscal management, pass. And transparency, good. When I was in school, a pass was pretty good for me. I mean, what should we take from this that it is a pass as opposed to a higher overall assessment? What does that tell us?
Well, I think if in general, I'd say that there's a lot of good things that were done in all the platforms, including the Liberals and the NDP and the Conservatives. And in terms of assumptions, it's clear we know what their planning base is. Mm-hmm. We know that they're working from the parliamentary budget officers sort of pre-election, pre-tariff impact baseline, so we can work from that. They're articulating challenges, economic and fiscal challenges. And they're highlighting risk with respect to the United States. So we can we score those. I think it's clear to us, like in this environment. I think it's clear to the electorate that we're dealing with a major crisis, and that's going to create is creating enormous economic instability. And I think why the Conservatives get a pass and not a higher rating, a good rating, is that. We don't think they've properly taken into account the additional risk from the instability that we're starting to experience already, and it's really going to get worse. So, I mean, that's why they get a pass.
Okay, so when we look at the revenue, though, that they put in there, because it's difficult to do a straight apples-to-apples comparison with the Liberal platform, which, again, we'll get to because they don't book the revenue. When you look at revenue gain from additional homes built, revenue gain from capital gains measures, revenue gain from repealing C-69, clean electric regulations, these things, are those numbers credible or not credible, or is it just their inclusion that you sort of quibble with because it's not standard practice? How should we interpret the critique of that?
I think that there's two issues, David. One is, first, from a transparency perspective, it's fine to see what a party thinks could be the additional economic impact from a certain measure, a deregulation measure, a red tape measure. This is what we think the impact could be on GDP. We don't have a problem with that. I think, again, as I noted, to actually book that, so to speak, so you show a lower deficit track, we do have a problem with that. It's not a standard practice. It hasn't been in Canada for many decades, including past Conservative governments, including Mr. Harper's government. I think there's a major credibility problem with respect to those estimates. You go back to past budgets. I've seen you in these lockups, David. You look at those rules of thumb. 1 percentage point of real GDP growth probably gives you, a positive impact on the deficit on the bottom line of about $5-6 billion. So to actually generate $60 billion in additional revenues from deregulation, from the cutting of red tape over 4 years, that is an excessively high number. And then overlaying that, you're letting it go to the bottom line. So we have a problem with that.
Okay, last question on that. So when we look at the deficit numbers that the Conservatives are projecting, it adds up to about $130 billion, or no, that's the Liberal. Sorry. Even with a combined $131 billion from savings and new revenues, the Conservative platform is projecting a total deficit of about $100 billion over the next 4 years. So how should we judge those numbers? And then I'll move on to what the Liberals have put on the table.
Well, I think we judge those numbers by looking at what's behind them in terms of the assumption that we just talked about, the credibility issue with respect to booking those estimates. There's in addition, other parties also have issues there, where other party platforms. They're booking what we call efficiency savings. We have, we see over time, and I've been around for many decades, including program review years. We often put out numbers, and we see there's a lot of slippage. And we can look at the conservative platform where they see program efficiencies. They're thinking they're going to find $10 billion with the saving 4 years out just on consulting, and like the total number for that number for professional services is about $20 billion. Actually, the management consulting part is quite a bit smaller than that. So I don't think it's possible to wipe all of it out. A lot of those professional services are security services, they're accounting services, they're engineering services. So again, we look at that number. I mean, it's good that from a transparency perspective, the fact that they actually highlight a number, we can see where that is helpful. On the program cuts point of view, sometimes we do see slippages in those numbers, but they are transparent on that. We know there are significant cuts to 4 and 8 as an example. They're being transparent. We know that they plan to reduce the size of the workforce. We can look at those numbers. Sometimes you do get slippage, but they are being transparent. I think in terms of the amount of deficit, here we are, David. We're probably headed into a recession.
Yeah.
And we're having one of our major political parties says they can actually reduce the deficit as we head into a period of significant economic weakness. The government spends about $500 billion a year. We're a little over a $3 trillion economy. It's typical. You want governments to actually help stabilize the economy as we go through this instability. Instead, we have a plan actually that tries to reduce the deficit, both relative to the baseline and from an annual, like year-to-year adjustment. So there's a fiscal stance problem that I think some economists will have to actually, is this the time to try to reduce the deficit, particularly in 2025-26?
Okay.
Wait.
And I want to get into the Liberals quickly now, because you've given them an overall assessment of good on all the 3 principles: realistic and credible economic and fiscal assumptions, good; responsible fiscal management, good; transparency, good. Now, responsible fiscal management, they've got the deficits that are tens of billions of dollars higher than the Conservatives. You give them a pass. So why is a higher deficit platform good and a lower deficit platform only a pass? Explain that gap if you can.
So, in terms of like the deficit tracks in both the Conservatives and Liberals, if you look at the numbers, if you deflate them by the size of the economy, in the Liberal, the Conservative track, which we have some issues with, if you include those, those assumptions with respect to, positive revenue gains, they have the deficit kind of at 1% this year, falling to 0.4% 4 years out. The Liberals have the deficit at 2% this year as a percentage of GDP, falling to about 1.4%. So a higher deficit track in a smaller platform. I think from the point of view where the economy at, the size of the amount of weakness we see in the economy, it's not unusual to see the deficit get a little bit bigger in a period of weakness.
Right.
We saw the 2008 financial crisis. We saw during COVID. So I think, there's not that much different as a percentage of GDP, 1% to 0.5%, 2% to 1.4%. It's not an enormous difference that I think, bond rating agencies are going to focus on.
But the big difference, Kevin, I guess, in the way the 2 platforms are presented goes back to where I started this. There is no revenue baked into the fiscal track for the Liberals versus what the Conservatives have done. So Mr. Carney said today that if he had prepared his platform the same way the Conservatives prepared their platform, he'd be showing a surplus by year 4. Is that an accurate and fair statement?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's true. I don't know that that's true. We didn't look at those sorts of numbers. Some credit to the Liberals. They did have an annex in their platform that did show the multipliers under different situations. Multipliers are like these positive economic benefits. If you spend $1 per capital investment, what might the return be? These returns, could be different depending on how weak or strong the economy is. So they present it, but they make a point, say we don't actually have prudence in this platform, but they do expect to see some positive economic gains from those, additional capital investment, which they are not showing. In fact, they're not even highlighting even as prudence, but they do make mention of it.
Okay, so just one last question, Kevin, before I let you go. So basically, if you stripped the revenue out of the Conservative platform and did it the same the Liberals did, or do revenue in the Liberal platform and the same methodology the Conservatives did, the deficit numbers are actually a whole lot closer together than the gap on first reading because of the different ways of preparation. Correct. Am I correct there?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
And I think it's probably fair to say we have we have under Mr. Carney, Prime Minister Carney, the Liberal platform, somewhat of a hard target. They're saying they're going to balance the operating budget, in 2028-29. So it's a hard target that Parliament can hold the Liberals to account. I actually think they'll have a hard time meeting that target. I think the Conservatives, they don't actually have a hard target. They have kind of a fiscal rule saying if we're going to have additional spending, we're going to offset it. And if we're going to raise taxes, we're going to have a referendum. But they don't actually have a hard target, though the Conservatives are showing a much lower deficit track, as you noted. And that would be consistent with a declining debt to GDP ratio, which is a good practice.
Okay. Real quick, that was the other thing I forgot. They, in the Conservative platform, they said that if they were ever going to raise taxes or change taxes in any way, and they would make this like a law, that the government would have to do a referendum. Ridiculous.
Yeah, so you want to have a referendum every single year on taxes, because that's the other thing too, is the tax code changes every year. I know I made more money this year than I did last year, but that doesn't mean I'm
Making more money.
Yeah, that doesn't mean I'm making more money. Does that make sense? My boss told me the other day, she's like, "Yeah, you're getting a 3% raise." I was like, "Cool, cost of living adjustment. Thanks."
If that.
Yeah, if that. So
Nice.
Yeah, that's a big issue too. Can you imagine because I know there's a CPP gross up or whatever right now on a lot of these incomes if you earn a certain level of income. That's crazy. So pretty much every time you have something like that, you have to go back and vote. And those referendums,
They're not cheap.
Cost so much money. And just all kidding aside, when you look at these people, how many people actually vote in referendums, let alone elections? So
and what are they going to say? Yes, raise my taxes. I can tell you exactly what the outcome is going to be.
And honestly, if people keep on saying no, are you going to lower these taxes? Soon we won't even have money to even pay for the services we want or need. It's bad enough our healthcare is falling to pieces.
I was just going to say, maybe being the 51st state wouldn't be bad if that's the way we're gonna go.
And honestly, I can't see people voting yes to raising taxes. I can't see that happening. Even if they did vote, do you really think the majority would vote for raising taxes? Especially the people who are entrepreneurs and wealthy Canadians, they're going to say no every single time. Yeah. And I worked for the government. Sorry to go on a tangent, but we couldn't even get people to pay taxes. Even people who were workers didn't even want to pay taxes, and they justified it based on the fact they volunteered in their community. What is that? Just because I volunteer in my community doesn't mean you don't have to pay taxes? I don't know. This is going to be a system where there's not even enough money to support social programs, let alone anything. I don't know.
51st state, here we come. So I wanted to play, those are the longest clips. I only have one other one, and it's a minute long. But I thought it was really important to keep in mind as we go through the rest of this, which we'll try to go through, in a decent amount of time since it's 6:30 for us. I wanted to talk about U.S. relations. Both parties had U.S. relations stuff in their platforms for obvious reasons. The Liberals focused more on it than the Conservatives did because, as I said earlier, the Liberals really, really want you to remember Trump exists. So really quickly, the Liberals matched 25% tariffs, which, by the way, I was a little confused about. German, you would know, in watching the debate, there was that question about, do you support dollar for dollar tariffs? Mm-hmm. And Mark Carney said no. So I was kind of interested in this. I know a percent isn't the same as dollar for dollar, but I feel it's kind of a tomato type situation.
Yeah, it definitely can be for sure. And it depends on the percentage too, right? When you think about it. And it depends on what you define as dollar to dollar. I think a lot of times these budgets and these things, when you say, I don't support dollar to dollar tariffs, well, if you don't support dollar to dollar tariffs, depending on like you said, tomato, it technically could be the same at some point, but I'd have to look into more the detailedness of what he meant by dollar to dollar, or even sourced out what dollar to dollar would mean to
It just
him.
feels like political speak to me.
It does. It definitely does feel like it's like you said tomato, tomato, or whatever, right? So
Yeah.
I just feel like he's just kind of changing the word to make it seem like it's not dollar to dollar, but it actually is. I'm not sure, like I said, but at the same time, is it helpful? Not at all. Is the moral of the story? It's not helpful for anyone, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's a
And
problem.
yeah. And then they go on to say temporary removal of the 1 week EI wait period to buffer trade related job losses, which I believe they already implemented pretty much right away when all of this started happening. Strategic response funds of $2 billion to protect the auto sector. They've also said that all tariff revenue will go to, again, help workers. And then they also, and this was kind of weird, and it might seem confusing to be in US relations and trade and tariffs, but there was a huge emphasis on food security, investment in greenhouses, hydroponics, and fisheries to sort of insulate us from those tariffs and trade issues. I was actually really happy to see this. Rio and I worked in student unions for a while together, and one of the big things was food insecurity. Rio and I spent like a year engulfed in food security research, which focused mostly on students, but we also had to look at the bigger picture of Canadian food security, which hasn't been great. So this was kind of one of those things when I was reading it as a sociologist. I was like, good, somebody's finally talking about things like food security. Later, we'll see that Mark Carney talks the Liberals talk about in their platform how to offset rental affordability, which is great because, again, German and I have talked about this week about how they're basically ignoring the rental market in affordability. So that was the Liberals, and then the Conservatives. Nothing really changed. They said maintain counter tariffs, same as Liberals match 25%. Use counter tariff revenue for broad tax relief and some targeted worker support. There are, again, some hair splitting between the two parties, but by and by, it's about the same. Both of them are saying they're going to use that tariff revenue to support workers in some way. Conservatives want to cut the GST on Canadian-made vehicles, create a $3 billion Keep Canadians Working Fund, offering low-interest loans and credit lines. And then they also pledged to renegotiate the softwood lumber deal. And then later they also pledged to renegotiate the trade agreement with the US. So I thought that was kind of weird because you would think that softwood lumber would be a part of that. And then they want to seek new trade pacts with UK, Australia, and New Zealand, as do the Liberals. So pretty
I mean, like, I'm pro Kanzuk. Like, I've said that several times. I'm pro Kanzuk. So it's nice to see that both of them are on the same page. But
you know what's interesting? I've noticed just in general, like just briefly reading it, they talk about, like Trump, for example, and the tariff situation in the state from Canada and the States. They talk about, like, for example, the Liberals talk about tariffs 16 times, and they mention trade wars 13 times.
Yeah.
And I know that in the Conservatives, they mention it's tariffs 7 times and uses the expression of trade war once. So you can see the language, you can see the word choice, and see how different it is. So I don't want to like dive into it because it could be another discussion on words and things like that. But I think it's
right up my
important.
alley.
I think that's more important to recognize is that you can see where the Conservatives stand on trade war or tariffs compared to the Liberals, for example. And it seems like the Liberal platform is focusing on this, declaration of sovereignty and threat more than the Conservatives are focusing on more affordability and crime. So you
Which
can
is
see
the
that
same throughout this whole campaign too, right?
Yeah, and that's how it's always been, right, throughout the campaign. So you can see where the Liberals are really focusing on and where they're trying to drive the narratives for sure. And you see that Conservatives are not really seeing it as a serious matter as much compared to the Liberals for sure. But but that's up to people to interpret themselves.
I mean, there's something to be said about the language conversation. I mean, I'm the sociologist in the group. I've talked Rio's ear off before about the importance of how we use language. And I don't know if you were here yet, but I was talking to Rio for sure earlier about how I was tagging how many times Mark Carney said the word sovereignty in his 65-page document, which was at least twice a page, and how often the Conservatives said lost liberal decade, which was also between 1 and 2 times a page. So there's a very different language approach. The Conservatives want you to remember Justin Trudeau. They want to be running against Justin Trudeau. They want to talk about affordability and where homes have been, which is quite interesting because the Conservatives keep pointing out that homes only cost $450,000 during the Harper era, which was a doubling to prior to that. So that kind of always makes me laugh a little bit. That's neither here nor there, though. But I think it's worth mentioning that it's important to pay attention to the language that parties are using, because it says so much about what they're going to do in government. I mean, platforms are one thing. And a lot of the time we probably will see changes to this. We'll see things that won't come to pass. But if you look at the language they're using, you can really start to see where their thought process is going to be and what they're going to do. Mark Carney, very much sovereignty, protect Canada. It is a little concerning because he also sounds a little isolationist in it when he talks about how much he wants to do with interprovincial trade. So that'll be interesting to watch come to pass. Canada's actually fairly new in free trade era. We were actually very isolationist prior to the 1988 free trade election. So that's within my lifetime. And I'm only 40. Well, 41, 40 and a half. So yeah, there's something to be said with how politicians are talking about the different issues, right?
Yeah.
One thing I did want to mention, Rio, did you have anything you wanted to kind of jump in there about? Good. One thing that I thought was kind of interesting, I don't want to spend like too much time on the NDP platform. Not that they're not relevant, but they're not going to form parliament. And I want this to be informative for people. But in their US relations section, they say specifically bar Trump from the G7 summit in Kananaskis over sovereignty concerns, which I kind of thought was funny. We do know the question has come up, well, how is Trump going to get into Canada because he's a convicted felon? Obviously, there are diplomatic exceptions. I did some research into this, and they have said that they will actually have to give, when Trump comes, an actual form, and there's somebody within the government that will be doing it. And it's basically been told, like, when Trump comes, you have to make sure this form is done and filled out. So I thought that was kind of interesting that they weren't just going to be like, whatever, just come into our country. They are going to have a process on what that looks like. That could change if the Conservatives win, obviously. What do you guys think of that? Because I thought it is quite a funny idea. It'll never happen because he's the leader of the United States. I don't know if he'll come. He might just send his crony, Rubio.
Yeah. I mean, that's just a new level of international pettiness, I feel like. Like, okay.
Fuck
yeah,
Trump.
like, yeah, like, you know, I get it. Like, absolutely not a fan of Trump. Like, hate the guy. But, like, I feel like there was Jagmeet Singh and the NDP could have used their platform to say something better. You know, like, I get it, but like, it's international pettiness. What are you going to do? Like, oh, well, he had to fill out a form. It took 5 minutes. Like,
yeah, I mean, if you watched the debate, you would know that Jagmeet Singh had a lot of pettiness going on, but it was strategic, right? And here's the one thing I will say about the NDP. Jagmeet Singh went into the debate in this platform basically fighting for his life. And his job right now is to say to Canadians, you need us to hold Mark Carney accountable when he gets power, is sort of the position he has taken. Now, with that said, if the Conservatives win a majority government, that's not happening, and they're going to laugh at him and tell him to go away. So he really is trying to fight back at this strategic vote. And that was to remind people that he existed, which is why he was being obnoxious in both leadership debates, to the point where the French moderator turned off his mic and was like, enough. I'm done with I'm done with your interrupting.
Yeah.
And I think he did a good job of it too, saying like, I'm here, pay attention to me. This is why you need me. I'm not afraid to say this to them. I'm not afraid to interrupt. I'm not afraid to be aggressive. I think that was sort of the point.
Yeah.
And his seat is is in Poilievre right now.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big issue, right?
For sure. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about crime and justice now. It seemed like a good sort of segue to talking about convicted felons, and now let's talk about what they'll do. This shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Nothing has really changed. The Liberals are very much a red Tory approach. Again, they are sort of doing a mixed method approach here. I think it's worth noting the NDP are very much, how do we prevent crime from happening in the first place? Will you build communities? Mark Carney, in his platform, the Liberal platform, has said, yes, we have to obviously prevent crime in the first place, but we also have to punish criminals. So there's a few things that the Liberals want to do. They want to shift the burden of proof to the accused for violent car theft, organized crime, home invasions, and certain human trafficking and smuggling charges for bail. The only issue I kind of had with this is because it said, and I put it in quotes here, which means this was like actually the phrasing, certain human trafficking and smuggling charges. What are the ones that are okay? That's my question there. Like, if you're taking this stand on organized crime and human trafficking, shouldn't it be you're facing human trafficking charges, it's enough to remand you, we're not giving you bail? Like, what are the certain charges here? Is just being the driver not enough? Like, so I have questions, I guess, is my thing on human trafficking, because human trafficking, and I've published in this area before, it's so complex, it's really hard to manage. There has been lots of research in this area, and one of the things that I've published on and looked at is just this idea of going back to language. How do different countries look at human trafficking? How is that defined within law, and what does that look like when you're trying to build a case? So there's, as an example, there's you guys might be too young to remember, but a big mall in Calgary had a shootout way back when I was like a teenager between two gangs. And years later, while I was a student at one of the universities in my city, we had a police officer come in who was on the vice unit and talk to us about human trafficking. And she was talking about how back then there was just two of them in this unit. And they were also responsible not only for gangs, but also for human trafficking and organized crime. And what happened was they were actually building a huge case out of Montreal against the Montreal organized crime. Once they kind of got wind of that, the mafia leaders in Montreal actually basically staged these two gangs to shoot at each other in this mall in Calgary, knowing there would be public outcry and people would be like, you need to find out who did this, like right now, which is exactly what happened. Basically, while our police agency's back was turned, they moved all of the witnesses into the US and they never saw them again. So these were like prostitutes and other women involved in the ring. So when I read this, it actually kind of pissed me off a little bit.
Yeah.
Quite a lot, actually. If you're going to, this is kind of where I think my conservatism comes out a little bit. Like, if you're going to remand somebody and make these bail changes, like, what is the certain human trafficking charges? I want to know what you're talking about here.
Yeah, and like full disclosure, the last time I've read the criminal code at this point was 2.5 years ago. So it's been a while, but I know, like, having done like social legal studies in my undergrad, I remember a lot of what made the criminal code kind of like weird, but also work was that it was very specific, but also just very general in a lot of places. Does that make a lot of sense? Like,
Yeah.
it's the kind of common law / civil law doctrine that we have in Canada that created the way it is.
Judges have a lot of discretion.
Yeah, and that's kind of, and I think a lot of that feels like, with judges having a lot of discretion, and then like the prosecution has like, I was talking to my martial arts teacher about this a little while ago, and he was saying, what'll usually happen in like say an assault or like a murder or something like that, right? The police might not pursue the more severe charge because it's harder to prove, but they go for the easier charge. So instead of saying like, it's a first or second degree murder, it's a manslaughter, right?
Literally why the US has tax evasion, because that's how they get mafia. That charge was brought in the US specifically to deal with mafia.
Yeah.
In the, I want to say 50s, maybe earlier than that, but yeah. And then of course the prohibition stuff. So yeah, absolutely, they do that all the time.
Yeah, so I feel like that's where a lot of that came from too, right? And like, I get choosing your words carefully, but I feel like this would be a good place to say like specifically what it is, right?
Well, and it's
like,
just making bail, right? So they're remanded. There's clearly enough evidence to have them charged and go to trial. So this is about like, you're putting the reverse onus on them, which is a whole other conversation, about why they should make bail. So I guess I'm just like, well, I don't understand what human trafficking charges would be totally fine for them to not have the reverse onus in that case.
Yeah.
If you're going down that road. German, I'll let you talk because I can see on your face you want to say a thing.
Yeah, I'll just say I don't have a very strong legal background compared to these two. But that being said, it is a very general thing. So, and it's probably made for that, like from my experience anyway. So it's more a lot of interpretation, and these judges have a lot of leeway in terms of how they interpret these laws, and it comes from that whole situation of like, rules and stuff like that and past cases and whatnot. So I'll just say that, and I think that it's always made that way, and that's the system we're kind of, I guess you can say, the system that kind of stuck with. So it's hard to have it more specific and more detailed, but that's the system we're kind of given, right? And we have to deal with that.
Well, and I think later the three of us need to have a norms discussion, because I think with what we're seeing in the US, that is a reason to change the system. 100%. We can't count on norms and vagueness. But anyway, I shall move on because otherwise we'll be here forever. They want to upgrade murder charges with intimate partner or sexual violence to consecutive first-degree murder terms. Fine. Conservatives say the exact same thing actually in theirs. Criminalize distribution of non-consensual sexual deepfakes. So for those who aren't aware, that would be like AI generations of people. They also both specify in their platforms that that'll be also non-consensual passing around of photos. Great, awesome. Both of you do that. Increase in penalties for non-consensual sharing of intimate images, which I'm also here for. So like, these are all things that they've been saying the whole time. But let's move on to the conservatives, unless you two have anything else you want to like talk about with the liberals.
No.
Cool. So as I said to Rio earlier, I'm going to let him talk through most of this because German and I have had two extensive, long conversations about this week. And that is the conservatives' intent to invoke the notwithstanding clause to allow for minimum mandatory sentences. And then also their proposal for the 3 strikes and you're outlaw. Another thing that German and I have talked about this week. So what I'll say, Real, maybe I'll just set the stage for this because I didn't actually do this in our last podcast, but I did spend about 4 hours yesterday researching some stuff. So what are three strikes laws? They originated in the US in the 90s, mostly in California. And basically what they said was after 2 prior convictions, a third conviction, no matter how minor, would result in an automatic life sentence. Now, in Canada, Poilievre isn't saying an automatic life sentence, but he did say at least 10 years, and there's a bunch of different stipulations on if they would be able to get out, including learning an employable skill, proving that you were absolutely perfect in prison. And he didn't specify that this would be only violent offenses. He has said that he did say that in the leadership debate that it would apply to violent offenses, but in their platform, the word violent was missing. They said offenses. Generally, three strikes laws have been really vague, as we just finished talking about, and they tend to have the third strike usually tends to be something petty, as German and I talked about this week for stealing a loaf of bread, but that would be any conviction.
Yeah.
Not that I think that many people are getting convicted of that, but there is examples in the research where exactly this has happened and it disproportionately impacts people of color, because of course it does. They also, over 50 years of research, they don't work. They're not a deterrent. There's usually some kind of public backlash when somebody does get convicted in something like minor. But also, interestingly enough, in the last about 15 years, we've seen research that shows that it also increases murder, like homicides, specifically of witnesses, because people realize that that's going to go towards their three strikes law. And so they eliminate witnesses. And that's what the research is finding. So that was crazy to me. So I guess that, with that said, Rio, what do you think about this? And for our listeners, just so you know, there's going to be a ton of links in the description on all of this research and stuff that you can dig into if you're interested in it. You can also check out German and I's discussion, which is already up on YouTube as of about 5 minutes from now. So Rio, what do you think about this?
So I'm going to start by saying my opinion on the notwithstanding clause and that it was a mistake.
Actually, before you say that, let's
Sure.
listen to what Mark Carney said about it, because I think it's you're going to go exactly here.
You have pledged to be the first prime minister in this country to use the notwithstanding clause, setting aside charter rights of, as you call them, multiple murderers. Why do you think that's necessary?
To be clear, I want to uphold the charter rights of Canadians under Section 7 to life, liberty, and security of the person. Right now, that right is violated by multiple murderers who are given discounts. The case in question was a gentleman who went into a mosque and shot dead 6 innocent worshipers. He got, according to this ruling, only one 25-year sentence, meaning he can be out in his 50s. He only serves 4 years for every murder that he carried out. That is outrageous. And I will use the constitutional powers that are created for this purpose to ensure that mass murderers stay in maximum security penitentiary for life. They will only come out in a box. We will also pass tough new laws that prevent repeat offenders from getting out. If you commit 3 offenses under the 3 strikes law I propose, you will not be allowed out of jail until you prove that you are drug-free, that you are behaved perfectly, and that you've learned an employable skill, and you've served a 10-year sentence. We cannot allow liberal crime and chaos to go on terrorizing our communities. What we need is a real plan for change so that we can bring back the safety and the security that Canadians used to take for granted.
Let me get Mr. Carney to respond to that. Do you think that's an appropriate use of the notwithstanding clause of the charter?
I think that the one of the core responsibilities of the federal government, Prime Minister, is to defend the fundamental rights and liberties of Canadians. And those fundamental rights and liberties of Canadians are outlined in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is 43 years old literally today. I think it's a very dangerous slope to override judgments of the Supreme Court of Canada. In fact, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms exists to protect Canadians from people like us on the stage. Politicians who may use their power to override fundamental rights. And the issue in using by the federal government, I'll stop here, is not where you start, but where will you stop?
Mr.
Where will they stop, Rio?
Okay, so first of all, I already said this part. I want to say it again because I stand by it. The notwithstanding clause was a mistake. It never should have been included in the charter. It was stupid. And like and I share the sentiment of Mark Carney that like it's kind of dumb to overrule the Supreme Court, which exists as a check to the government, right? Like it's what the system's fundamentally built on was, in the case of Canada, responsible government, where you have the judicial separate from everything else, as opposed, or similar to checks and balances in the United States, right? Like you need to have that kind of, you'd have some kind of balance there. And I wanted to point this out because this is from the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. They posted a statement on Twitter. Twitter.
Interact with Twitter.
Okay, I'm interacting through.
You mean X?
Yeah, I'm interacting with Twitter.
Oh, I mean
Reddit,
Twitter.
So I'm okay. But in their statement, it even points out that the use of the notwithstanding clause to overrule the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in R.V. Bissonnette would set a dangerous precedent. It is false to suggest that we can either protect the public or uphold our charter rights and freedoms. Our system of justice is rightly founded on the principle that our society can and must do both, right? And like, Nick, you and I have talked about this before, where like mandatory minimum sentences have died in the Supreme Court twice now. And like trying to do it again, and this is me just absolutely harping on Premier Poilievre, it's like this is a very Harper-esque policy trying to make something work that's already been shot down twice. And like,
and there would be a limit to it too, because he'd have to solve that crisis within 5 years.
Yeah, and like,
so it's lazy.
Yeah, it's like how do you do that, right? Like you can't really. And again, kind of tying it back to what we said earlier, like, 1,000 extra RCMP officers, great, but like, what's that going to stop? What's that going to accomplish, really, right? When most of your crime is concentrated in like major urban centers. And like, if that third, like, say someone had, two offenses against them already. And like, if the third one was something just really petty, like you mentioned earlier, it's like, well, what if the guy just had a gram of weed on him, right? Went to a black market dealer for some whatever reason, like he didn't want to go to a fucking like pot shop, buys a gram of weed, gets pulled over, gets nailed by a cop for it. Like, what? So that guy deserves to go to prison for the next 10 years, like just because he had a gram of weed?
Probably longer, given those conditions.
Exactly, right? And like, it's just one of those things where it's like, well, you're
do you
trying
think you could argue that his employable skill is working in a pot store?
Okay. No. But like, and that's the other thing too, is like, what do you define as an employable skill? Like, are you talking about a trade, or are you just talking about like, not punching people when you go out in public, right? Because like, by that logic, most prisoners probably go into prison not having an employable skill, but technically have an employable skill. Like, it depends on how you define it. So like, what are you saying here as a threshold for letting someone out within those 10 years? And like, the other thing too is like, well, if you want them to learn a trade in 10 years in prison, how are they going to get welding equipment to learn how to weld in prison? Like, it, just as an example, right?
But also, sorry to interrupt, like these employable skills, to be a welder, to be a plumber, to do all these trade type related jobs, you need to be bondable. You need to have someone that's no criminal record.
Yeah.
And like I have a friend's brother who was studying to become a plumber. Studying for the plumbing exam is extremely tough. He failed like 3 or 4 times to write his exam. So it's tough to even get those things. Do you think the prisoners in prison would actually do those exams?
Yeah, and actually,
like, they're brutal exams. They're like sitting for any type of exams. Like,
well, and we've talked about that too, right? Like the revolving door that ends up happening because they can't get a job due to their criminal record.
Yeah, and also like it's tough to even like to come out to do it, right? So it's just not like it's not easy to get a job, because a lot of those jobs you need to be bondable and you need to have no criminal records. So how do you even do
So
that?
then the question and the suspicion from me becomes, that's the point.
Mm-hmm.
And
But
like,
that's tough, right?
yeah, actually, Jeremy, I wanted to mention this too because I actually used to work for the apprenticeship office like back when I was back when I was an undergrad. It's a really interesting job experience, I gotta say. And like, you're right, a lot of so we would have apprentices come in and write their exams like twice a week, and there would be some of them that like would show up for 4 weeks, like 3 weeks in a row to try their exams, fail twice, pass the third time, or fail the third time and have to completely restart their trade. So we'd see them again, like, a year later and be like, weren't you? And I remember actually having this experience. Like, I looked at the list and I was like, weren't you higher in your trade last year? And then he was like, no, I failed the last period exam. So I had to like restart my whole trade. I was like, that sucks, dude. Like, you basically just like lost 3 years of training and got sent back to being like, I think he was like an electrician or something at the time. And like, he basically just lost his 3 years and had to go back to the start of the trade just because of an exam. And like, and a lot of these trades are all highly technical. They have a lot of like, you need a lot of knowledge to actually be successful in trade, and let's also consider the fact that a lot of prisoners tend to be like, lower education, lower socioeconomic status, like lower access to the resources to really be successful in these kinds of positions and trades, right? So like, how would you kind of encourage that while they're in prison, and if we're being totally honest, likely getting the teeth kicked in all the time, right? Like, we all know prison violence is a very rampant thing.
And also, like, you need the practical experience a lot of times, and you need the hours. So that's like any professional career. You need to have hours. And if you're stuck in prison for a violent crime, whatever violent crime is, especially if it's murder, like, it's like going to be tough to get the practical experience in prison, right?
I mean, they're never getting out. Remember, he's putting you in there till you're a million.
And so, like, you're not even going to get the trade. You can't even practice, right? And honestly, like, to when you look at these people trying to get these trades, like, I know we talked about it before, Nick, about the fact, like, it's the root of the problem we're not solving. We're not solving the big root of the problem. We're just kind of covering it with these things, right?
And costing us money.
Exactly. And who's footing the bill? That taxpayers would be paying their training, even if they don't get it. Yeah, some people might actually take advantage of that training and become citizens and productive people, but at the same time, that's a lot of time, money, and until we see that benefit, would it be actually something that's feasible? Like, you have to bring people in to train them too, because I don't think you're going to be sending them out to get the training. So there's a lot of logistical questions I have personally of how that's going to work.
One of the things that I've been thinking about, because this is something that we didn't discuss, German, is well, we did discuss the Oakes test, but to use the notwithstanding clause, it's temporary. It has to be in a crisis, so you have to define the crisis, which provinces have kind of abused over the year. And when I say provinces, I mean Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Quebec. And it's, like I said, it's temporary, so you have to do it within 5 years. Now, there is a way in law to override people's charter rights, and that's through something called the Oakes test. I won't go into as much detail, but basically in 1986, it was established in RV Oakes, and basically you have to show that the law's objective is pressing and substantial, and that the means are proportional. So meaning the law must be rationally connected to the objective, impair the right as little as possible, and balance the benefits against the harm. I suspect Poilievre doesn't think his law would pass the Oakes test. But what I would be really interested in, because minimum mandatory sentences seem to go back to the Supreme Court every single fucking time we have a conservative government, what I want to see is a community organization bring the question of, when can these governments actually use the notwithstanding clause? Like, what is the definition of actually, like, what does a crisis look like? What standards does that have to meet? And I think that would be a better use of the Supreme Court's time, because clearly these governments don't give a shit what they say about minimum mandatory sentences, since it keeps going back to them.
Yeah. And like I really like that idea too of like actually having the Supreme Court define like, this is a crisis constitutes da 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 da, right? Because like right now what we're basically having is Pierre Poilievre being like, well, there's a crime crisis in Canada, and like, in aggregate, crime is like, yes, kind of going higher, but not, I could literally pull up the crime stats from our neighborhood a little while ago because I was curious, and like it's really funny to see like, no, there was one crime to like there were no crimes for like several consecutive years, and like doing that to Calgary is like, you can see they're like, oh yeah, there were like 5 murders. To like, oh yeah, there were like 3.
It's different types of crime, right? So like right now the biggest problem is car theft in Canada, and both parties have talked about car theft a lot in their platforms. But does that constitute a crisis because car theft is way up? So like I would just be really curious to how like what that looks like at the Supreme Court level, and for the Supreme Court or like somebody that has the means to do it goes to the Supreme Court and says this is ridiculous already. So any last words on crime before we move to defense and border?
No, but I will just reiterate the notwithstanding clause was a mistake. We should absolutely get rid of it. If that takes another constitutional convention, let's do it. Like, I hate it. Let's get rid of it.
It's long and hard as it should be. I mean, the notwithstanding clause was put in basically just to appease the provinces so they would sign on to the charter. Yeah. It's the only reason it's there. It was never really meant for the federal government to use, which is why no federal government has ever used it before. And I think why people are so alarmed that Poilievre's like, no, I'd totally do that. Even Harper backed off. Like when the Supreme Court said minimum mandatory sentences are unconstitutional and against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, he was like, oh, okay. And then he went and passed some other terrible tough on crime legislation.
Yep.
That's a whole other conversation.
Thanks, Harper.
Thanks for giving us Poilievre. Defense, we won't spend too much time here because we kind of covered it in the intro. I guess the biggest thing is both parties want to raise NATO defense to 2%. Thinking about it, one of the things I guess I wanted to ask is, what are your thoughts on, does NATO even still exist? Like, is the argument we need to raise NATO spending to 2% to appease Trump? Or is the argument, holy shit, Trump's insane, so we have a crazy person to the south of us? Russia and China are able to invade our Northwest Passage and Arctic space because of the melting ice, and they are getting really bold about it. So is this really like a NATO thing? Because there's been lots of chatter in the US about how like NATO's basically dead at this point. Trump, like if Russia invaded one of the little NATO countries near them, do you think Trump would actually intervene?
No.
He would not meet his NATO requirements in any capacity. He'd be like, well, sucks to be you. Guess you're going to be part of Russia. A lot of you are going to die. So yeah, like, what are your thoughts on this? Like, do we just call it like it is at this point?
I mean, okay, so my opinion, so the rest of NATO still exists.
Yeah,
right?
but without
and
the US, like,
I know, but without
on.
You're right, without the US though, like there's really not much we can do, right? And this is weird conversation I had with my family, but we were having I was talking with a cousin of mine and an uncle, and then we just somehow got on the topic of like geopolitics. And then I was like, well, if you think about it, like the United States has the largest nuclear arsenal, followed by Russia and China, right? Several thousand nukes for the United States, several thousand for Russia, a few hundred for China. And then you look at the rest of the like global nuclear arsenals, and like most of them top out at like maybe 50. Like even that's being pretty generous. I'm pretty sure like the UK only has like something like, I want to say like 55, 47, something in that neighborhood.
I mean, does it take more than 2?
Well, that's the thing, right? And like, so, and then I remember explaining to them too, because they're like, well, no one's going to risk nuclear war. I'm like, well, the thing is, like, no one's going to risk nuclear war, but conventional war is still a thing, right? Like, look at Ukraine. It very quickly devolved into trench warfare and artillery. Like, it's World War I. Like, it's World War I tactics, right? In an era of like drones and missiles, which is
Although it's turned into a drone war.
yeah, which is frankly a lot more terrifying, where like you can just have an FPV drone like fly beside you and blow your head off, right? So like, you know, reaching the 2% NATO defense target is, you know, great start. And I've said this before in the podcast, especially in like our Arctic sovereignty one of like, we need to actually evaluate that number being higher than 2%. And like, we need to evaluate the possibility of actually expanding the Canadian military to do a lot more than just what it currently does with its, what, 70,000 active service members and like 150,000 reserve. Like, how are you supposed to defend the second largest landmass in the world with only what, 250,000 people and like, you know, a bunch of really outdated equipment? So like,
well, and both, it's worth saying that both parties want to expand equipment and expand recruitment and pay military personnel more, but that's all a product of, again, holy shit, Russia and China, and Trump's crazy. It's not a NATO thing. Like, they're saying we have to meet our NATO targets, but I guess again, this is like me splitting hairs. I just find it frustrating that our leaders can't just say, like, we're in a bad situation here.
Yeah.
The US has lost its mind.
Yeah. And actually I had another thought too, because last year my girlfriend and I went to Australia, and like, it's very strange.
Jealous of you.
Yeah, great trip, but it's a very strange experience to kind of like walk around and say, I'll pick on Sydney as a very easy example, because I spent a few more days there. You would see posters being like, join the reserves, join the Navy, join the Army, da 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 da. You know, you'd see that a lot more often. And even we were walking through, I don't remember where it was, but it was near the Opera House. And then it was just randomly, we just saw a military ceremony. And like, we stopped and I was like, can we just stop and watch this for a second? I'm kind of curious as to what's going on. And like, it was just like a commemoration of like, yeah, you know, like, you know, with these soldiers died doing da 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 on these dates, you know, we're here to remember them. You know, it was one of those things that you don't see that often in Canada, right? Like, I see that every year on Remembrance Day. That's it. I never see it anywhere else.
Yeah.
And like, that also says a lot about the national pride of Australia too, right? So like, you know, I feel like we should be doing more of that kind of stuff where it's like, no, you have to put it in people's face, like, no, this is an option. And another side note that I think is also really funny, I had a conversation with another friend of mine a few weeks ago, and we were in this car and we were talking about like, yeah, you know what, there's a little bit like a few years ago, I didn't know what to do with my life. So I definitely had the thought of joining the Army. And I was like, hey, buddy, same. Like, I didn't know what I was going to do after school. Like, I wasn't being offered any jobs or anything. So I was like, you know what? Fuck it. I can join the Army.
There's been a lot of conversation on US podcasts specifically about that. The Bulwark has had several military, like Gen Z military members on, talking about how like they're doing it because they have no other option. And specifically, it's not in the US, it's not just about money, it's also about healthcare, because military service members get really good health coverage for them and their family members, right? So I remember specifically there was one Gen Zer that was talking about how they like basically felt trapped in the military because they just weren't economically in a position not to be, which is like also kind of horrifying when you think about it.
But when you look at the defense and things like that, like Trump is just crazy anyway. So like, bluntly saying, and so like even like Trump says we should increase spending to whatever, but knowing Trump, he may take himself out of NATO too. So like, without
taking himself out of NATO already, it's just not on paper.
And that's the problem, right? You know, like Trump is so irrational and so unpredictable right now. So even if we have this NATO thing and whatnot, Trump may say you need to up it even further, right? So, or even leave NATO. Like, he's technically leaving NATO. So,
which I guess is why I just want them to be like, and I was surprised the Liberal platform didn't just flat out say like, the US is like basically torn up NATO. It's not a thing anymore. We need to build up our military to defend our sovereignty, given how much they use the word sovereignty in that whole document, never mind that section. And they did say like to protect our sovereignty, but they kept bringing it back to NATO. And I was like, I don't understand why any of you people can't just say because we're not dumb. You can see it, I can see it, my husband can see it, neighbors can see it, my niece can see it, that there's a problem and NATO doesn't exist anymore. So I guess that was just something that frustrated me in both documents.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. It's also, you have to realize that a lot of times these, like anything related to the UN right now is under questioned right now anyway. And legitimacy is kind of really focusing on now whether it actually has any power to do anything, because it's just countries together, right? And I think that's another discussion, not for tonight or today, but that's another question to ask. It's like, are these institutions like UN and NATO really able to do anything? They can't even control the war in Ukraine and Russia and places like that. How are they going to control? How is countries going to come together, right, and really support each other? Like, it looks like they can't even agree.
They also, if you notice, haven't said jack shit about Trump shipping people off to gulags.
And I know, like, they have no, like, honestly, like, you think about it, like, yeah, they're great in theory, but it takes everyone to really.
Well, they rely again. It goes back to the norms thing.
Yeah,
norms
and not every country will agree. And like a lot of times, you have to have 100% or majority of people, member countries, supporting it and going for it. Otherwise, it doesn't even go anywhere, right?
Yeah.
I wanted to tie that into, Nick, of like, really the UN is a norms-based and norms-creating kind of organization. Like, international law is technically a thing in the sense that like treaties exist
at best.
Yeah, but it's really easy to throw a treaty out, just be like, well, that doesn't exist anymore, because just look what Russia did to Ukraine, right? Like, they agreed to never invade, and then here we are 30 years later, they invaded Ukraine, right? So like, it's very easy to just kind of like throw international law out, and it's also, but at the same time, it's also very easy to just be like, no, international law says we can't do da 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 da. It's like, well, what's stopping you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's tough, right? International law is tough, right? And like I said, I'm not here to debate international law today. It's just a long conversation that could be down the road, right? And like, honestly, I wish UN was a lot more decision-making power, but again, it doesn't run its own government, right?
Yeah.
Fun times.
I know. I used to have a big thing for United Nations, but after seeing the power it has absolutely no power at all.
Yeah.
After visiting New York, full disclosure.
Speaking of gulags, let's skip ahead to immigration. We kind of already covered taxes, and German and I have talked a lot about housing and affordability. The one thing I will say about housing and affordability, quickly, is because German and I had been talking a lot in the last week about nobody talking about rental income. Well, the Liberals did it in their platform, and they've actually put out a few policies to launch and oversee affordable housing in Canada with caps, which they specifically said they were including for rent, basically rent control, to help with affordability. So we're not going to talk about that. Again, there'll be links in the descriptions. You can go back and hear our extensive conversations this week. Let's talk immigration, because we haven't actually talked about immigration this week or really during the campaign at all. So quick overview. Basically, the Liberals, their big thing was maintaining current immigration caps until Canada's basically at capacity where we can actually accept newcomers, because they're of the belief that we have to be able to support them, right? In terms of affordability, in terms of housing, the economy, jobs, etc. No surprise here. The Conservatives' big things were high population growth to new housing, healthcare access, and job availability. So that was the same as the Liberals, basically. They want to cap significantly asylum seekers, which the Liberals specifically left out. And then they want to crack down on international student and temporary foreign worker fraud. The reason I bring this up, and I know, hey, maybe your farmer thing won't be an issue anymore because I'm about to go nuclear here, but this is very Trumpian. Like, this part of the document to me was very very Trumpian. They talk about temporary foreign worker fraud, cracking down on international students, capping asylum seekers. Where did the stuff in the US start? So again, I'm not saying that Poilievre would go as far as sending people to gulags, but honestly, did any of us in November think that Trump would send people to gulags? Like, we all knew he was a nut job, but I don't think anyone saw that. Even Anthony Scaramucci has been talking on his podcast about how he knew Trump was insane, but never thought that would be a thing that the US government would actually do. So I think with this big red flag, like, we really have to look at it and ask ourselves, like, as Mark Carney said, like, where does it stop? We all know where I stand, so I'll throw it to German first.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and that sounds, like you said, exactly like Trump's stuff, right? And yeah, like, do we really think he'll go towards it? But at the same time, he's playing from the same playbook. I'll keep on saying that. I know people say, "Oh, you're not giving him a chance." Well, we gave Trump a chance, and look what we have now, right? But
well, and is Poilievre looking at the US and going, "Could I get away with that here?" With the way the polls are going, I'm thinking not. But
like, I don't think he probably can't right now for sure. But if he gives a chance, he'll probably be able to, right? Not to say he won't, right? He's not hiding the fact that people in his party support Trump, right? And people are his Trump supporters around him. So,
and we've talked about that dynamic before, right? Like, he's having this weird trying to balance, like, appealing to the center and also knowing that he has Trump supporters that are in his party.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And like, will he do it? I hope not. But at the same time, who knows at this point? You won't know until you elect the guy. And if he's given
that risk.
And if he's given a chance, he probably will do it to some extent. And he's taking similar situations. Like, it doesn't sound as Trumpian in terms of like content-wise, but it could be interpreted and even enforced in ways that are Trump-like. But I've talked too much about this from the last few weeks, right?
I know, me too. Let's
and so I think I want to hear Rio to talk, because I think Rio would have a different perspective than me, for example.
I mean,
I don't think it's going to be that different knowing Rio.
Yeah, because it isn't. Like, I share the same opinion. It's the Trump style playbook of like, well, the border's insecure and all these criminals are coming in. You know, they're killing our fucking children and drugs and fentanyl and whatever, right? So like,
which is the narrative that Poilievre is giving right now. He keeps talking about the fentanyl crisis, which fair, but he has been using it as justification. Like, in his in the platform document, he refers the Conservative Party of Canada refers to safe injection sites as, and I quote, drug dens. And it took me reading halfway through the platform to figure out what the fuck they were talking about. And finally it dawned on me, oh, they mean the safe injection site.
And like,
you can't understand, sorry to interrupt, when you can't understand what the hell is going on, that is another problem.
Yeah. And like, yeah. But like, and that's where it gets really frustrating for me too, because like, as someone, okay, so just like, as someone whose like partner came from another country, then became a citizen, and her whole family came from said country, right? Like, I can't knock immigration. Like, it's a very good thing that has resulted in something very good for me, right? But at the same time, like, hearing Poilievre pull this out is just very like, ew. I'm not worried because it's like, oh, like, yes, more people can't come into the country. I'm worried because it's like, well, if you're already talking about this, like, what's the next, like, what's stopping you from being like, we're going to start revoking PR statuses, or like, we're going to make it harder to become a citizen, or like, you know what, like, that citizenship that you got by coming here.
He's already talking in their platform about changing the citizenship oath, which sounds like really mundane, but
that's something
to your point.
Well, and then actually, it's funny you mentioned that too, because when my girlfriend went through her citizenship ceremony, like, I sat there, like, and it was an online ceremony, to be fair. The guy was in Manitoba, and like, it was her and 70 other people. But like, we were sitting there, and then like, hearing her recite the oath was just one of those things where I was like, yeah, you know what? That's very solidly Canadian, right? And like, can I recite the oath to you now? No. I don't know it. But I just remember like hearing it being like, yeah, you know, that's really important. But like changing it to adding, what was it? That like I will honor and like serve and da 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 da. Like that makes it sound like it makes it sound like you want me to worship you or like worship a certain subset of people for the like privilege of citizenship. And it's like, so you're effectively making a second class of citizens just in like a very inadvertent and roundabout way because they came here and not because they were born here. And I say that as someone who was born here, right? So like, so yeah, I'm not a huge fan of this. And like, I really can't be on board with it because it's very like, no, this is something that could absolutely affect like, you know, people I care about, you know, and people I see, you know, once a week, because it's like, well, yeah, we're gonna go visit our family. It's Friday night, gonna, you know, have dinner with them and da 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 da, right? And like, I can't imagine going there and being like, oh yeah, you know, Uncle whoever got deported last week. It's like,
Which is
yeah,
a very real thing happening in the US. Like people that voted for Trump are having their spouses deported. And I'm like, you have an immigrant spouse and you voted for Trump.
Yeah.
I found the citizenship thing. They want to add to the oath, I pledge gratitude to those who worked, sacrificed, and gave their lives to defend the freedom I now enjoy and to build the country of Canada I now call home. Like them, I pledge to fulfill my duties as a Canadian citizen, which seems mostly fine, except for like the first part's kind of weird. I didn't do a lot of looking into what the citizenship oath looks like because, like I said, I was up until 2 a.m. reading this document. But that first part about like, I pledge gratitude for those who work, sacrifice, like, I just kind of wonder like why and how much different that is than the current one.
I actually just pulled it up. So do you want me to read it out real quick?
Yeah, I want to see the difference.
Please read it.
So the oath of citizenship is a legally binding and oral written contract intended to ensure that new Canadian citizens promise to obey the law and customs of the new country. Its current form is, I swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty King Charles III, King of Canada, his heirs and successors, and that I will faithfully observe the laws of Canada, including the Constitution, which recognizes and affirms the Aboriginal treaty rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and fulfill my duties as a Canadian citizen. So, like,
okay, so that's like a verbal contract, and he wants to. That makes it so much worse.
Yeah, and like the oath itself is already very like, well, I'm going to do my job as a Canadian citizen. Why are you? You're making it sound like mandatory military service is a thing for anyone who becomes a citizen. Like who naturalizes as a citizen, right?
It's interesting you bring it up because actually when I was president of a nonprofit organization, which is one of the oldest nonprofits in the country, actually we got to participate in several citizenship ceremonies. Our club actually was one of our mandates was to encourage Canadians to come to Canada and also kind of promote heritage in Canadian institutions. And so when you look at the way the Conservatives want to bring it up and talk about, you know, like you want to pledge, it's like you said, talking like you're going to the military and going to fight war. Like the one right now is very, very basic. It's bad enough it would be even more complicated if you add the random stuff that sounds like.
And hearing that it's a legal contract gets those red flags up higher for me.
And like legal contracts, you as someone and Rio is studying law, it's going to be some of those situations that are like more focused on like an actual contract of something, which is a bit sketchy.
Yeah, and again, as you guys talk about the military, like where does it stop? So if he does say like, oh, mandatory military for new citizens, like you can't put citizens in different categories. So is there already like a thought process there? I don't know. And maybe that's like very conspiracy theory like, but this is where our politics are now. You have to like over scrutinize every freaking thing that a politician says rather than just rolling your eyes like you did in the 90s and be like, is Bill Clinton really that different than Bush? Was Obama, who like blew up a couple hospitals with drones, that much different than Bush? Not really. This is like a whole new level.
And do we want conscription even for citizens too?
No.
Yeah.
Like that's another thing he could have done too, right? And like honestly, like, do I want mandatory war and fighting? I don't know. Like I said, I don't mind joining the military on my own accord, but to be forced into it is another problem and another story, right?
Especially now.
Yes, especially fighting overseas like Ukraine and Russia. Like I would tell people, like when you go to war,
Our grandparents are all like rolling over in their graves right now.
like you go to like when you fight war, you can't tell the difference between who is the enemy and who is your friend, right? So you'll be killing your friend down the road. I don't want to go through that right now.
Well, that was a lot darker than I thought it was going to be. So we're going to move along to the closing and talk about polls like we always do for our last segment, because they're also making me really nervous and I don't like that. So there you are. Share screen. Okay. I like bringing up the map. So since the leadership debate, a couple interesting things has happened. The Conservatives are the same. German and I have talked a lot this week about just the Conservatives like basically having their vote. And they're right at that threshold of, according to CBC Poll Tracker, which is, again, reminder, average polls, newer ones are weighted heavier than older ones. They're at 38.3%, which is in a normal election, Conservative majority territory. But we've kind of seen the collapse of both the Bloc and the NDP. But since the debate, what we've seen is a few upticks in the NDP and the Bloc in Quebec. Blanchette did a really good job in that debate, I think, of convincing Quebecers of sovereignty and the need for his voice. That's kind of normal. That didn't surprise me. What I'm concerned about, and I kind of want to get what you guys think, and if you have the same concerns, is this NDP number, because polls always underestimate the NDP. And I think this is because the NDP are really, really good at mobilizing on the ground. So if we look historically over polls over the last basically forever, as long as I've been alive, the NDP's always outperform the polls. And right now, with these kinds of numbers, basically the Liberals are really needing to rely on the strategic vote, ABC, anything but Conservative, which has been working. Pre-debate, the Liberals were projected to win 196 seats. You need 172 for a majority. And right now, it's sort of the BC where people are looking at it and going, what's going to happen out in BC? That's where they're mobilizing. I mean, it's kind of crazy. Anything could happen out there. Singh is kind of looking at losing his seat to a Conservative because him and the Liberals battling it out. And what happens when a Liberal and a Conservative battle it out? The Conservatives come right up the middle and take the seat. So even though I think it'd be really funny for the leader of the NDP to lose their seat to a Conservative, now is not the time to like please my humor side. So like, what do you guys think? Do you think I'm like overreacting to this NDP thing? Like, do you think the numbers are, because they're at 8%, 8.4%, but that's up since the debate.
So
sorry, I'll just one last thing. Or is this just like a few NDP supporters are like, oh, the Liberals totally have it bagged, I'm gonna go back?
So my opinion is that like I think the NDP is kind of doomed, and this is from like I'm pulling this off of Reddit. It's a screenshot from Abacus. Among people who have already voted in the advanced polls, the Liberals already have a 7-point lead over the Conservatives at 43%, Conservatives at 36%, NDP at 11%, and Bloc at 6%. And then there's another poll. Who was this? Nanos. This was 14 hours ago. Again, Reddit, favorite place to go grab stuff. NDP was at 7.7%, Liberal at 44%, and Conservative at 38.5%. So like, I feel like it's still overwhelmingly likely that the Liberal Party is going to win. Like, to the extent, good question. But like, I don't think that the NDP is really going to rally as hard as you think. And my opinion is mostly just based on the fact that like, normally I would see at least a few NDP signs in like Southeast Calgary, but I haven't seen any.
They're
if at
liberal
all.
this time, aren't they? Thinking
Yeah, they're
about
all
it.
liberal, and like it's really weird because like I'm in a part of the town that's like very, very conservative, and like I was
Yeah, me
driving
too.
home and I was like, "Whoa, that's a big liberal sign, not like just a little lawn sign. That was a big one."
Do
right?
you think so? Like, we're in Calgary, which we don't like to dox ourselves, but like I think people have figured that out by now. So it's really interesting to see people in Calgary putting up red Tory signs.
It's really
Yeah.
weird, and like I don't know. I feel like I've never seen an election where that's happened more than this one, which is very strange. But also, like, part of me is like, huh, I guess things can change. Weird.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring those things up because like I met a guy who is the son of the NDP candidate in my riding. And
Don't dox yourself that far.
and I didn't and I said I see no NDP signs around the neighborhood. And he said to me his dad is technically saying, I don't feel like I need to campaign because I'm probably not going to win, let alone do well. I said, well, at least give a bit of actually do decent. Like actually put the signs up. People vote for you. If they see you, they might just vote for you anyway.
That's actually pretty normal for Calgary.
It's pretty normal for Calgary for sure. And then he convinced his dad, and his dad has tons of signs now around the community.
But it's amazing what happens, right? Like in my riding, which is near Rio's, where we live really close together.
We're like literally next door ridings now. So.
Yeah, super conservative. Well-known guy in my riding. I hate him. But he only won by 1,500 votes. And that NDP guy was like hardcore going out. I know he came to my door and I just opened my door and I said, you already have my vote. Go talk to my neighbors. Go talk to the guy across the street. I know he's super conservative. But like things are changing a little bit, I think. And I think that like red Tory thing helps, right? Like Rachel Notley's NDP are not Singh's NDP by any stretch of the imagination, which is why they're the official opposition in Alberta, right? So like I kind of almost wonder how much that like Mark Carney dynamic is playing into. There's like 3 signs on my street for Liberals, and I know though in the last provincial election all 3 of those people had obnoxiously like UCP signs up. So it's quite strange.
The thing about the NDP, it's that it's right now it's the struggle between voting anything but conservative, because the problem, like we talked before, is that if you vote the NDP, you're technically splitting the left vote.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest issue right now that a lot of people are struggling with. Like, to be honest, I don't trust polls anyway at the best of times, because they kind of don't really tell something the whole story on election night. But at the same time, these polls are good kind of gauge, but the NDP could be almost wiped out. They say, right, if they could get from 2 to 13 seats, which is almost technically being wiped out.
Well, you need 12 to be an official party,
right,
in Canada.
So like technically, if they get if Singh loses his seat potentially,
he's toast if he loses that seat.
And
He still might be if he doesn't.
If he loses a seat, technically the others might fall as well, right? So like I think that is going to be, if he's starting to pull really behind, that's a problem for the NDP, because that's going to be a big issue. You can't even vote for that leader, right?
Yeah, it's quite telling. And like I said, it's in danger right now of the Conservative coming up the middle, which any riding that has had Singh as their representative for as many years as he's been in Parliament obviously won't be happy with a Poilievre Conservative.
No, and they're projecting like very low numbers for the NDP anyway right now. Like it could be 2 to 13. So it's like, yikes, right?
Yeah.
It's like pretty much non-party status, right? And like the Liberals could be pretty high anyway, like 200 over seats. Like that's crazy, right?
I'm scared enough of Poilievre that I'm fine with it.
But it's just I'm just saying, like it's just very, 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 very crazy, right?
Yeah. For sure. Yep. Awesome. Okay, well, I think that's a good place to leave it, because I know I'm exhausted. All I've been thinking about is politics all week. So unless you guys have anything to add, we'll say goodbye and keep checking the the YouTube channel. I haven't read the comments, but if either of you two are interested in reading comments, I saw today there was like 10 comments on one video, and I was like, nope. But it does speak good for engagement. I was engaging with a young Gen Z fellow on our comments who quite seems to like you, German, even though he was like, I am voting conservative. I'm hoping that he'll write me back because I was curious to know, A, how we did in terms of talking about culture. So if you guys haven't checked that out, go check out our conversation on the Gen Z vote. On this Gen Z vote. But what I wanted to know is how close we were, but also like why he was feeling that way. And I was like, no judgment, but like could you tell me why? So I'm kind of hoping he'll write back. But yeah, if either of you are interested in checking out comments, do like, subscribe. We're going to keep having these conversations. Try to remember we are people behind the camera. For my own mental health, I had to stop looking at Facebook comments and YouTube comments, but we will try to keep up with you guys. We're on Blue Sky, where we're getting a lot of engagement right now, so you can check us out there. You can also check out our website, bsexplained.com, where we have a lot of articles up, including some neutral articles that go more in depth into the platforms. So until next week, we'll see you in the next one.
And I'll just quickly say, Nicole, before we sign off, I'll just say, like, honestly, remember to be constructive when you do those comments, because I think that's where the discussion comes through. And that's the most important thing, right? Like, it's important to be educated, but at the same time, be constructive. And like Nicole said, we're people. And so, yeah, you can criticize policy, but don't criticize people.
That's a good, and don't be sexist. I'm tired of seeing sexist comments. There was one that I deleted this week. I don't know if you saw it or not, German. But they were like criticizing me on something and saying like how awesome you were. And I was like, the thing you're talking about, literally I said my piece and then German was like, yeah, I totally agree because blah, blah, blah. And so like, just stop being sexist. That would also be great. Let's just have a conversation, an open conversation about these policies, because keeping it focused on policy in times like this is really important.
Yeah, and don't criticize people. That's the big one, right? Criticize the policies. And like I said, if you don't like it, that's fine. But at the same time, we're not here to impress people either.
Okay, guys. We'll see you in a week or two.
Take care. Bye.